do this. It's a huge honor. It has not been nerve-wracking at all to prepare for this, but let's do it. This gentleman needs no introduction, obviously here, but I'm going to give him one anyway. George R. R. Martin is an acclaimed screenwriter and author of science fiction, horror, and fantasy. He has sold over 15 million books worldwide, and his work has been translated into over 20 languages. In 2011, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He is the best-selling author in the English language right now. It is my honor to I heard that on the internet, so it must be true.
I don't know. I think J.K. Rowling and Stephen King might have something to say about that.
Yeah, but the movies are done, and you're right in the height of your powers, sir. Thank you for sitting down to talk to me today. This is a huge honor, and I grew up reading and watching your work, and I also feel very much like a newbie author. I've written exactly one book and had one movie made, so I feel like there's a lot I can learn from you. And if you don't mind, I want to tell a story. I quickly just want to tell a story about how I met Mr. Martin. It was at San Diego Comic-Con last year, and there was a Random House party that I went to because I heard that he was going to be there for that very reason. And then when I showed up, I realized there were a bunch of other writers there who were there for that very reason as well. And George was in the back. And I saw people pushing past Peter F. Hamilton to get to George, and so I worked up my courage and made my way back there, and I shoved Christopher Paolini out of my way, and went up and introduced myself once I worked up the courage. And the first thing George R. R. Martin said to me was, "I loved your book," and then my head exploded all over me. So after I picked up pieces of my skull off of his shirt, he reached out and he handed me this coin, and I looked down, and it was a Faceless Man coin. It said Belong Julius on it, and I think I passed out. And so I'm, all men must die. I'm going to cash that in sometime, maybe to kill some studio executives, but that was my experience meeting George. And after we talk, there's going to be a Q&A, so you guys will be able to ask all of your Song of Ice and Fire questions. I'm going to kind of work up to that, and you guys can just hit him with all of your questions after we get a chance to talk. I'm really excited to talk to you because I'm always fascinated by writers and filmmakers who started out as really passionate fans, and you can kind of see from a very early age, that they had already found their destiny. And so I'd like to ask you about your own fandom during childhood and how that set you on the path to becoming a writer. I know that you grew up in a housing project near the docks in Bayonne, New Jersey, and you began your writing career selling stories to the other kids in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I wrote little monster stories to some of the other kids in the projects for like a nickel. Which with a nickel you could buy a Milky Way bar in those days. 2 nickels would get you a comic book. So ultimately, now looking back, the comic books are actually a much better investment. Because the Milky Way bars you ate and then they were gone, but the comic books I kept, and now they're worth a vast fortune. But it was a short-lived professional career. I wrote and sold a number of stories to the other kids in the neighborhood. But then one of them, they were all monster stories, as I call them. Werewolves and vampires and space monsters and stuff. I would always eat the people at the end. And one of the kids, one of my regular customers, started having nightmares, so his mother came to my mother and put an end to my career there. So that was the end of that. And then a number of years passed before I discovered comic book fandom, which was just in its infancy back then. And I met people. I talked about this a little at my lecture at Cushing last night, but I met Howard Waldrop, which started my connection with Texas. And we started corresponding, and I started getting comic fanzines and then writing little amateur superhero stories for them. I couldn't draw worth a shit, so I couldn't be an artist, but I wrote what they called text stories in those days, which were basically superhero stories in prose, and published them in these little amateur magazines.
I dug up on the internet a fan letter that George wrote to Fantastic Four. It's printed in Fantastic Four number 20. He had several letters to Stan Lee printed in various Silver Age comic books. And this one is from November 1963 when George was 15. I'm just going to read a little bit of it. I just love this because you can see his enthusiasm for kind of everything. He said this is okay, I got permission. Dear Stan and Jack, Fantastic Four number 17 was greater than great. Even now I sit in awe of it, trying to do the impossible, that is, describe it. It was absolutely stupendous, the ultimate utmost. I cannot fathom how you could fit so much action into so few pages. It will live forever as one of the greatest Fantastic Four comics ever printed, ergo, as one of the greatest of all time.
Stan liked to publish really critical letters.
Have you ever run into Stan Lee since?
Yes, I've actually had the honor of meeting Stan Lee about 6 times, I think. And every time I meet him, I'm meeting him again because he doesn't remember me from the previous time. It's a humbling experience meeting Stan, and trying to describe to him who I am, and but that's cool, But he's the importance of Stan Lee can't possibly be overestimated. In that letter, I believe I say he was better than Shakespeare. Probably a verdict that the history of literature will not uphold, but nonetheless, in the history of comic books, he's one of the huge figures. I think he's up there with Siegel and Schuster, and to this day, I'm still a fan. I'm still a comic book fan, a superhero fan. I go to all the Marvel movies and the DC movies too, but I go to the Marvel movies, and I have a rule for the Marvel movies, which is you can tell how good they are is how close they stick to Stan Lee. If they basically transplant the story that Stan Lee told, they usually have a pretty damn good movie. If they start fucking around and their own stuff, then it gets worse and worse here. So Stan knew how to tell the story.
I agree. Can I ask what your parents thought of your fascination with horror and fantasy, comic books, and science fiction?
Well, I got good grades and stuff, so my mother and I guess my father were pleased with that and didn't really care what I read otherwise. My father thought all this stuff was weird. He called it all weird stuff. He liked westerns. And this was the 1950s, of course, so half of television was westerns. We could go through entire nights where we'd, watch television. There'd be a couple sitcoms and then a couple westerns, night after night after night. There was an endless supply of westerns, and there was only like 1 or 2 science fiction shows on, most notably Twilight Zone, which, somehow I did convince, we only had the one television set, so it was always an issue of what we would watch, and my father was the ultimate arbiter. If he was watching it, he didn't want to watch it, it didn't get watched. But somehow I wore him down with Twilight Zone, and I wound up getting to watch a lot of Twilight Zone, so he'd sit there and shake his head, this is weird stuff, what is this? He didn't like that much at all, but we got to watch Twilight Zone. So
how big of an effect was Rod Serling's Twilight Zone on you? You were 11 and 12, I think.
Yeah, I was still in, I think, grade school and maybe the first year of high school. Well, I loved Twilight Zone. It was my favorite show, far and away. I look forward to it eagerly every week and see what Serling would come up with. And I began to notice writers' names there, television writers for the first time. Rod Serling, Charles Beaumont, Richard Matheson. Between the 3 of them, they wrote like 90% of all the Twilight Zones ever made in the first incarnation. And I learned to actually recognize the 3 bylines, even as a 12-year-old kid, which is unusual. Normally, we don't notice the names of writers, or in those days, even directors or actors when we're watching things. But I actually decided at one point that Matheson was the best of those 3 because I liked his Twilight Zone episodes the best. But they were all great. All 3 of those writers were incredible writers, and they did some of the best television ever done. And oddly enough, of course, 25 years later or so, I found myself working in a revival of Twilight Zone, which is pretty freaky. prizes for us.
I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. I wondered, did Twilight Zone make you seek out Richard Matheson's fiction, or were there other fiction writers or television shows that had?
I read, both Matheson and Beaumont had novels and short stories out that I did seek out. Notably for Matheson, the Incredible Shrinking Man was one of his, and I Am Legend, which has been made into a movie 614 times. And one of these days I'll get it right. But the Incredible Shrinking Man was pretty incredible and shrinking. Had the great fight with the spider at the end, which is amazing. The cat chasing him through. I know it. Probably to modern audiences, I don't want to geek out too much talking about these old movies and television shows, because I know that many of you are, strange to say, younger than me, and might not share my nostalgic appreciation for these. I know the special effects and things like that are primitive, but damn, they were good stories, and the special effects, and many of them were state-of-the-art for the time. And a real science fiction fantasy fan should be able to suspend their disbelief and not expect modern CGI techniques of something made in 1954. It's sore point with this. Okay.
So you sold your first story for publication at age 21 to Galaxy Magazine, and then became a very successful writer almost immediately. He's nominated for a Hugo and Nebula Award just a few years later, and your short fiction won many awards, and that was how I first discovered George's work. Was when I was a teenager in the 80s, I discovered the Wild Card stories, which just blew my mind, and Tough Voyaging, his Haviland Tough science fiction stories were amazing. If you haven't read the Haviland Tough stories, this is kind of a darkly comedic science fiction hero with a really cool spaceship and a soundically enhanced cat, and who dies, and he clones his cat when it dies. It's just like some of my favorite science fiction when I was a kid, and because I saw that you mentioned that Jack Vance was one of your inspirations for those stories. That turned me on to Jack Vance, who's one of my favorite.
Jack Vance was great. Yeah, genius, greatest living science fiction fantasy writer.
It's true.
Belongs in every pantheon we have.
And then, so you moved on from short fiction to writing novels, and your first 3 novels were very successful: A Dying for Light, Windhaven, Lisa Tuttle, Fever Dream, and then your 4th novel, Armageddon Rat, was kind of a turning point for you. Could you tell me where you at, describe where you were at in your career when that book came out, and how that changed things?
Well, I was a rising young star. I was hotter than sliced bread. Every novel I wrote was nominated for major awards, and everyone got a bigger advance than the one before. And I had actually written 2 science fiction novels, Dying Light and Windhaven. When I wrote Fever Dream, even though it had a vampire thing, they said, well, this is not genre science fiction. We moved this to the main list. So even though they were both Simon & Schuster imprints, I moved from Timescape Books, which was their science fiction imprint, to Poseidon Press, which was a big bestseller kind of imprint. So Fever Dream was published as Poseidon, and then I wrote Armageddon Rag, which was my rock and roll novel. And they said, this is it. This is the book that's going to make you a household word. This is a bestseller. And they gave me a 6-figure advance for it. First time I'd gotten a 6-figure advance. That was real money back in 1981. And the book came out, and nobody bought it. It wasn't a bestseller. It wasn't a good seller. It wasn't a reasonably okay seller. It was a dismal seller, and it was a rock and roll novel, but rock and roll fans didn't buy it. It was sort of dark fantasy, but the fantasy fans didn't buy it. Nobody fucking bought it. It got great reviews. It was nominated for a World Fantasy Award, which I lost to John M. Ford and The Dragon Waiting, probably deservedly. Ford's book is an incredible book. But nobody bought it. And then, the thing about this publishing industry, not unlike television and film, is you're only as good as your latest thing. So basically my career was over. I then could not sell my fifth novel, which I had 200 pages written and was trying to market, and nobody was interested. So I had to go to Hollywood for my sins and work in the vineyards of television for 10 years because my books were now considered unpublishable because I was such a dismal sales failure. The writer always gets blamed. It's never the marketing director or the cover people or something like that. If a book doesn't sell, it's the writer's fault. So at least that's the way it was back then. I still it's still that way pretty much. But it all worked out in the end.
Well, I'm fascinated. I'm a screenwriter, and I'm just starting to work in Hollywood, and so I'm fascinated by your transition from being a novelist to writing episodic television in the 80s. In the 80s, Twilight Zone revival. That I saw that. I was about the same age that the original Twilight Zone aired for you, and it was my favorite television show. I love the 80s Twilight Zone reboot. You wrote many of my favorite episodes in the second season, especially the King Arthur kind of themed episodes I just really loved. And so I'd like to ask you what that kind of experience was as a novelist kind of entering Hollywood in the 80s. I know it was different in Hollywood then.
It was, although more it's different, more stays the same, I guess. But the Twilight Zone revival was the product of a terrific writer-producer named Philip DeGuerre, who, oddly enough, was a big rock and roll fan. He was a Deadhead. He loved the Grateful Dead. He loved the rock music, and Phil and I had the same Hollywood agent. So that agent showed him the Armageddon Rag when it first came out, before we knew what a dismal failure it was going to be. And Phil liked the book, and he optioned it for a feature film. Phil was working in television a lot, but he wanted to break into feature films, not only as a writer, but also as a director, and he thought this would be the perfect vehicle for him to do it. And, the Armageddon Rag is about a fictional rock band called the Nautical, and there's some huge concert scenes in it, which before the advent of computer animation would have been difficult to film. But Phil had his in with the Grateful Dead, so he had this great scheme. He was going to film the Nautical concerts at Grateful Dead concerts, and just use the people who showed up to hear the Dead play to be the Nautical fans, and thereby generate giant crowds without having to pay giant crowds of extras. And it would have actually worked if he could have gotten financing for it. But Phil and I had several meetings about the Armageddon Rag, and he wrote a couple screenplays, tried to get studios to finance it, but nothing ever came of it. But what did come of it was that I got to know Phil, and as I said, Phil was mostly working in television. He'd come up through the Stephen Cannell organization, working for Cannell on a number of different projects, rising through the ranks as a writer and a writer-producer and then supervising producer. And finally he created his own show, which was a detective show about two brothers called Simon and Simon, which proved to be a big hit. And once you have a big hit, then then they offer you all sorts of other things. So CBS came to Phil and said, "Phil, this is great. We love Simon Simon. We want some more shows from you. What else you got that you can do?" And Phil said, "I want to bring back the Twilight Zone. That was my favorite show. And you own the rights." CBS actually owned the rights to Twilight Zone. So they said, "Okay, sure." And Phil called me up, along with a lot of other science fiction writers, Robert Silverberg, Marlon Ellison, a lot of other prose writers, to give us the chance to write a script for Twilight Zone. And I did, and one thing led to another. I found myself on staff. I wrote 5 episodes. I sort of came in at the end of the first season, and then I was there through the shortened second season. So it was my first Hollywood experience. It was exciting. I had some good experiences and some weird experiences and some bad experiences, but I learned a lot. 4 of the 5 scripts I did for Twilight Zone were adaptations of existing short stories, because since I'd never worked in that medium before, I said, rather than trying to come up with a good story, let me pick existing good stories that I know are good stories, and then I can just concentrate on learning the form and how to write a good teleplay, rather than actually having to come up with an entire story. But then the fifth one I did, I came up with an original story, so I was finally getting my feet under me there. And then the show was over because, you know, our ratings were plunging downward every week, which was the hard part. You know, there are some great things about working in television and film. I liked being parts of a show, that show, and then Beauty and the Beast that followed. You know, you write a script and then millions of people see it. You know, I realized that by the time the first script of mine, as I said, Twilight Zone, to revive Twilight Zone began very strongly. The nostalgia value of the old Sterling name was very strong. So when we debuted, it was a ratings powerhouse. But then it began to decline and it began to fall off. And I think, you know, that period of the mid-'80s was the year of the anthology in television, where not only with CBS with Twilight Zone, but also they tried to revive Alfred Hitchcock Presents without Alfred Hitchcock. Steven Spielberg launched Amazing Stories, so it was a time when everybody was trying to revive the anthology format, and of course what they discovered is that we all thought that was a great idea. It was something that really excited writers and directors and studio heads and all that. The only people who didn't think it was a great idea was the audience, who didn't watch the show in droves. And within 2 years, every one of them was gone. For whatever reason, television audiences really don't want a new cast and a new story every week anymore, as they did back in the 50s. They want continuing characters, continuing storylines that they can follow every week. But it was a great experience for me.
Everybody always skips over from Twilight Zone to Beauty and the Beast without mentioning Max Headroom. When I discovered that you worked on Max Headroom, that just shook me to my core. I love that show. It was like the first cyberpunk television series, and so I'm going to take my opportunity to ask you about your involvement with Max Headroom.
Well, my involvement with Max Headroom was frustrating because I did 2 episodes for them, and neither one got made. So, you know, that's the dark side of Hollywood, or the frustrating side of Hollywood. Is that they don't always make what you're doing, you know. When Twilight Zone was dying, you know, we weren't canceled yet, but, you know, at one point they took us off the air for a while to retool us, and they changed the format from an hour to a half hour and all that. We could see the handwriting on the wall. At the same time, this British show, Max Headroom, was being brought to the United States. And Peter Wagg was the creator, the British guy who had created it. He was coming over. But Peter had never worked in American television before, and working in British television is really quite different. So the network, I think it was ABC that was doing Max, decided he needed an American showrunner to help him. He would be one showrunner and they would have a second showrunner. So they turned to Phil DeGuerre because of Phil's experience. And so Phil, of course, brought along a number of us Twilight Zone people with him. Jim Crocker, Michael Cassett, and myself all were going to write scripts for Max Headroom, and presumably if we got the pickup order, would be on the staff on the show. And we all did, the first step in the Hollywood writing process is to do a treatment, or sometimes called a story with option to tell a play. So the story is basically a plot summary. So we did six of us did plot summaries. Crocker did one, DeGuerre did one, I did one, Cassett did one. And, you know, and then we workshopped it together. We were all kind of working together. And my plot summary was called Mr. Meat. And it was about meat, giant mutated cancers that people were eating 20 minutes into the future. And everybody sort of, I mean, Max was a satirical show. And in its original British incarnation, it was a dangerous show, too. It took no prisoners. It mocked people, you know, relentlessly. If any of you television fans out there watch a lot of British television, you know that British television really has a sharper edge to it. Whenever they take these British shows, and they make them into American shows. I mean, compare Ricky Gervais' The Office to the American version of The Office. Compare Steptoe and Sons to Sanford and Sons. You see this process of softening always taking place. Compare, for Christ's sakes, Gordon Ramsay's British Kitchen Nightmares to the American Kitchen Nightmares. I mean, Gordon still yells at everybody for the first 3 quarters of the show, but in the American version, they all have to hug him and tell him they love him at the end and have him sing him. That didn't exist in the British version. Less hugging. And unfortunately, the same process took place with Max Headroom. So when we finally got the order from ABC to the network, they said, great, thanks for these 6 stories, we think it's great, it's going to be a terrific show. We're ordering 5 of the stories, but this Mr. Meat one is disgusting. So they killed my story, so we didn't get to do that. But then I did a second story for them, and that was called, they tapped on me to do their Christmas episode, which I called Xmas. And I came up, it was once again a very cynical story and fun. It was the Max Headroom Christmas episode. It's Xmas, because of course all religious thing has been taken out of Christmas 20 minutes into the future. And Network 23 is running this great Xmas promotion where, the most generous person in the world will get all their Christmas purchases for free. And you measure this by tapping their credit cards. So if you spend the most on Christmas gifts than anyone in the world, all your purchases will be free. It's a great promotion.
Yeah,
so much to think of. Of course, the person who finishes second, their Christmas purchase is nothing. And the person who finishes third, and the person who finishes fourth, and the person who finishes all the way down to 8,974,000. So it's a great way to promote Christmas purchasing. Very good for the economy. So again, it was a very kind of cynical show, and I liked this when it was put into production. I wrote a full script on it, and we were going forward, and it was in pre-production when Max was canceled. Max, like Twilight Zone, was a show. Max began tremendously, huge ratings. Max Headroom was on the cover of Time magazine as hot new cultural trend, and then every week the ratings went down and down and down. It actually lasted less than a season, I think.
12 episodes. I was watching George.
Yeah. So we were in pre-production on Xmas when they pulled the show off the air. So that one didn't get made either. So neither of my Max Headroom stories ever got made, which was disappointing.
I'm disappointed. But then, and then you went into...
The great part about Max Headroom, of course, was that everybody thinks that Max was actually a computer guy. He wasn't. He was Matt Frewer in makeup. There were no computers involved. It was all made up. It was really amazing. Now they could do Max Headroom. They could actually create Max Headroom. I did have one contribution to the show that actually got on. Back in the days when we were, doing those first 6 scripts, and we were all commenting on each of the scripts and suggesting things. Network 23 was owned or was in relationship with this giant global mega corporation, the Zigzag Corporation, that was dominated by China, and we needed a voice for that, the head of the Zigzag Corporation. So, the name Max Headroom, of course, comes from British parking garage signs. Max Headroom, 12 feet. Peter Wagg had seen that. So Ped Zing was my contribution. Driving around Los Angeles, I would see it painted on the sidewalks. Ped Zing, pedestrian crossing, and I made Ped Zing the head of the Zigzag Corporation, and that actually got picked up by everybody else's script. So
that's awesome. Look at this nugget of information I uncovered about Max Headroom. Ped Zing, that's amazing. And then, was that immediately right after that you rolled into Beauty and the Beast? I'm fascinated about your experience with Beauty and the Beast because I know that you had to deal with standards and practices even more than on the Twilight Zone, and they wanted to turn it into the Incredible Hulk. I've heard you say
they did. Yeah, they did.
It was I heard you describe it as it's a lion man ripping bad guys to shreds every episode and leaving their entrails on the floor, but you had to do that without showing any blood.
Any blood, no blood whatsoever,
So I'm curious about how your time working on that show and just working in television, how did that change you as a writer and prepare you to go back to novel writing in 1996? It seemed almost immediate after Beauty and the Beast ended that you went back and started writing novels.
I actually just started writing Ice and Fire in 1991, which was basically I spent 10 years out in Hollywood. I was on Twilight Zone for 2 years and then Beauty and the Beast for 3, with a little Max Headroom sliver in between. And a few, occasionally. I mean, it was actually an odd time in my life because I really regarded the Twilight Zone as a one-time thing. I didn't think of myself as a screenwriter or television writer. I thought of myself as a novelist. And the Twilight Zone was such a unique show. It was, Phil Daguerre, with whom I had a relationship. And he had brought in a lot of prose writers, and it was an anthology show. I couldn't imagine myself writing a show, about T.J. Hooker or something, or the latest episode, working on somebody else's show with these characters. But I got in on Max Headroom right at the beginning of it, which was kind of cool because I got to help shape the show. And, in the back of my head, it was, okay, Twilight Zone is over, and now I'm going to go home and resume where I was up to 2 years before. But I had an agent who was determined to keep me working in Hollywood and would keep setting up all these meetings for me that I would go to. I think I must have driven my agent mad because I wasn't eager to get some of these jobs. So he would insist that I go in and take these meetings. And he would say, get that job, go in there, impress them, you're great, you'd be great for it. I don't know if I really want to do this kind of show. He set me up to go right at the beginning. Star Trek: The Next Generation was starting, and they'd actually kind of started right around the same time as Beauty and the Beast. And as Beauty and the Beast was in trouble, he set me up. I remember a meeting for that, and I went in and. The guy says to me, I said, well, I don't know, first of all, he started the meeting, pissed me off by saying, well, I'm not quite sure who you are or why we're having this meeting, but our agent wanted to set it up, and, well, I think we're having this meeting for me to possibly be a producer on the show, and, who I am. I'm George R. R. Martin. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer. I was on Twilight Zone. I've won the Hugo Award and the Nebula Award, and I've done all this other stuff. And he said, Star Trek, there's a common misconception. Star Trek is not a science fiction show. Star Trek is a show about people. Oh, okay. Right, you fooled me. I thought it was a science fiction. It was the spaceships and the aliens. Confused me. Needless to say, I didn't get hired on Star Trek Next Generation. And there was some other show my agent really wanted me to go in, and it was, God, I don't remember it. It was a short-lived show about someone who probably shout out the name of it. It was like this guy inherits from his dead uncle an antique store, and he sells all the antiques, and then it turns out they're all cursed. So every week he has to go back to one of the people he sold the cursed butter churn to and get it back before it wreaks things, because otherwise these antiques will do a horrible job on the world. I said, why doesn't he just not sell the antiques? And then you wouldn't have a show here. They didn't like that either, so I didn't get that job either. So I really didn't think I would get any of these jobs, and I'm not sure I wanted any of these jobs. But then Beauty and the Beast came along, and it was sort of an intriguing premise, and they sent me to pilot, which was extraordinary. I mean, they'd already filmed the pilot. Ron Koslow script, Ron Perlman, Linda Hamilton, Roy Dotrice, beautiful, mythic, kind of gorgeous show, wonderful soundtrack by Lee Volkridge, gorgeous cinematography, magical underground chambers under New York. It really pushed all my buttons, so I couldn't resist when they wanted me to work on that one.
I almost skipped over. You also had your first feature film made from one of your short stories right around that time, 1987. Night Flyers came out, which had a screenplay by Robert Jaffe, who was the writer of Demon Seed and Motel Hell, and it was directed by Robert Collector, who eventually took his name off the movie. And I'm wondering what that experience was like. I'm sorry for bringing it up.
Yeah, that was a mixed experience. I can't hate Night Flyers because, Night Flyers actually came along right around the same time as Twilight Zone. I'm going back and forwards in time over a 10-year period here talking about my career, but I was in serious financial trouble in 1983, because of 1983, 1984, 1985. I was in bad financial shape, and it was getting worse because of the failure of the Armageddon rag. The rag had failed. Nobody wanted to buy my new novel. I was selling a few short stories, but you can't make a living selling short stories. I had made a big mistake. I mentioned the Armageddon rag had sold for a 6-figure advance. And it had taken me about a year to write. And I made a mistake that I think other young writers have made in time. I said, okay, I made $100,000 and it took me a year to write. I now make $100,000 a year. And I started spending money as if I made $100,000 a year. I bought a new car, I bought a new house, a much bigger house than I previously lived in, and had a much bigger mortgage. And, now when nothing sold the previous year, suddenly from a guy who made $100,000 a year, I'd become a guy who made $50,000 a year. And, then when nothing sold the next year, I was suddenly a guy who made $33,000 a year. And I'm still living on that money, and now the money is gone, and I'm drawing into it. I'm getting a second line of credit. I'm living on my credit cards. I don't know how the hell I'm going to survive. So freelance writing, let me tell you this, if any of you out here are aspiring writers, you seem like just hopeful young people here, but I don't want to crush your little dreams, but being a writer, if you're a storyteller, you want to tell stories, if that's your dream, it can be a great thing to do, but it is not a profession if you need security. It is a profession of ups and downs and dramatic swings where you can be the king of the world one day and the next day nobody will return your phone calls. And I've been on both sides of this, and in this case I was in, pretty bad shape. And then the Jaffes, who had optioned Night Flyers a couple years before for really a small option, smaller than I would normally have taken. But I've been in business with these guys. They'd optioned Sand Kings for a few years, never made it. They'd optioned Night Flyers for a few years, never made it. And now they came back and they wanted one more year's option on Night Flyers, but they said, well, we don't have much money, we can't pay you what we did previously. And what the hell, you've already paid me pretty good for previous options, I'll take this little tiny option for a year. And then they picked it up, and when they pick it up, you get the pickup fee when principal photography starts. So I remember jumping around with Paris, my wife, in our house saying, the Jaffes have picked up the option, the Jaffes have picked up the option. Because we got a shitload of money and suddenly I could pay off my debt. And Robert Jaffe wrote the screenplay, which was actually pretty faithful to my story. And we got this guy, Robert Collector, to direct. And I visited the set. It was a low-budget science fiction movie. I knew that going in, but I thought it looked pretty damn good for a low budget by the standards of like 1985 or whenever it was that we were making it. And I thought the script that Jaffe had sent me was pretty good. I mean, if you like my story, I thought it was a pretty good translation of my story. But unfortunately, feature films are a director's medium, and the director had ideas of his own, and he started messing around and changing things. And the script got less and less faithful and more odd. As Jaffe directed it, and they made some, I don't know, strange casting choices, I thought. Not that they had some good cast members. They had some, James Avery was in it, who most of you probably know from he played the father on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, but he was also on Beauty and the Beast for 2 seasons as Winslow. Terrific actor. He's a big, beefy black guy. And they made him the cook on The Night Flyer. My short story, there is no cook. And I was sort of troubled by the fact that they added this black character and they made him a cook. But there they were. And, and they made some other unfortunate changes. They got a famous rock star's wife for one of the roles, and she was not good. They had to recast that role, throw her out after a week of shooting because she couldn't do the stuff, and there were other things. But the main problem, I think, was the director. And when he finally turned in his masterpiece, he was a first-time director, so he got certain perks that directors get in feature films, but he didn't have final cut or anything like that. So the Jaffes took it back over and tried to salvage it by recutting it. And he didn't like the way it was being recut, so he took his name off it and put on a pseudonym. I never saw his cut. Obviously, the cut that was released had problems by itself. But I heard some of the things that the Jaffes were going through, and I got to think that their cut was probably better than his cut. He had some very odd ideas. He wanted, I don't know if any of you have read Night Flyers, but more familiar with the movie. But the movie is about a team of scientists who are going out in search of this legendary extraterrestrial life form that supposedly lives in the dark between the stars. And they rent this kind of beat up old freighter, the Night Flyer, as the expedition. And the captain of the Night Flyer is a mysterious figure who's never seen. And as they're on the ship, accidents start to happen and they start to die. And there's the sense of a strange presence that's kind of haunting. It's sort of a haunted spaceship story. And, there's supposedly a growing sense of menace there. And, I was, you heard the director at one point, he got in a big fight with the producers about the soundtrack and who to hire. He said he wanted to put the audience in the place of the people in the crew who were going more and more uncomfortable. So he wanted the soundtrack to be like subsonics and screeches and like nails on the blackboard sounds and things that would be really disturbing and upsetting so that the audience would be feeling more and more uncomfortable as they watched this film. And, the soundtrack would be giving you a headache and making you really squirm in your seat and, And, my reaction to that was similar to the producers. Are you out of your fucking mind? Yeah, we don't want to give the audience a headache. No, I don't care if the people on the ship are getting a headache. Yes, the telepath is getting a headache, but I don't want to extend that to the audience. They will not like the movie then if they have a headache. So we didn't go with his version of soundtrack. But the movie flopped anyway, so what the hell. And they seem to be concentrating here on the great failures of George Orwell.
I'm sorry.
I have tanked in every medium, in books and television.
Okay, we'll move on to you. I just have one more question. We'll move on to your great success. I know all these people are going to ask you about a song like Ice and Fire, so I just wanted to hear about all the ways Hollywood broke your heart. I'm sorry.
We haven't gotten all my failed pilots and failed feature films, though.
I know. Well, I was going to go into Doorways, but I'm going to skip over Doorways. If you want to watch Night Flyers, you can watch it on YouTube. I did it last night. And also Doorways, which is a pilot that George made. It's kind of like Sliders, but better, that never got picked up. You can also watch that online. But I want to, before I open it up to questions, I just have like 2 more questions I want to ask. First, I've always wondered this. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, George Raymond Richard Martin. Did your mom know to give you 2 R middle names? You were going to be an epic fantasy writer, or is that just a massive coincidence that you had 2?
It's just a coincidence. I was given the first R at birth, but I was raised Catholic, so the second R is a confirmation name. Catholics at the age of 13 are confirmed in their faith, and at that time it's traditional to take a new middle name, a confirmation name after some saint or relative or someone that you admire. So I took my cousin Richie's name, and that became the second R. It's interesting. I don't know how many of you are here just for AggieCon and how many of you are here for the exhibit, but you know, my books and papers are stored at Texas A&M at the Cushing Library, the special collections. And in the last 2 days, they've done a huge exhibit for it. They opened a huge exhibit called Deeper Than Swords, and if you go over to Cushing on the 2nd floor, they have 2 big rooms full of my manuscripts and papers and rare editions and things about my career, including that letter that you read from. They have the Fantastic Four number 20, and they have in the same display case another letter that I had in Avengers like a year later. And so you can see these 2 letters I wrote as a communicator to the comic books. But what struck me in touring the exhibit last night was that Fantastic Four letter is signed George R. Martin, and the Avengers letter a year later is George R. R. Martin. So obviously my confirmation came in between them, and you see between the 2 letters the first time I started using the R.
That's interesting. And I know you admire Tolkien, and I'd like to talk to you about 2 ways in which I think that you improved on what Tolkien had done. I feel like The Lord of the Rings is missing 2 key elements of real life, sex and religion. No one seems to be worshiping anything in Middle-earth ever, and it's also hard to imagine anyone having sex. Whereas Westeros has many religions and people are having sex all the time. So I wonder if this is like a conscious improvement or decision that you made?
Yes, basically it is. Tolkien, did have a number of children, so it's probably true that he did have sex. But those were times where you didn't speak about them, or you certainly didn't write about them. If you did, you wound up being banned in Boston and condemned by the Catholic Church, Legion of Decency and such. And Tolkien was a practicing Catholic, and it would have been very upsetting to him to be banned by Legion of Decency. So he wasn't going to include any sex, but there's certainly a lot of romance in Tolkien, particularly if you look not so much at Lord of the Rings, but at the Silmarillion, the Beren and Luthien. I mean, he had a romantic side to him. His tombstones and that of his wife actually say Beren and Luthien on them. So he was a romantic. But I was of a different generation. I was born in 48, so my childhood was in the 50s and the early 60s, and my college years were in the late 60s, which some of you may have heard of. Often called the tumultuous 60s or whatever. We invented sex. No one had ever had it before. But it was great. We had all this free love and make love not war and all that stuff, at least in theory. It always seemed to me when I started writing that sex is an important part of life, male and female relationships. And as I read history, it seemed to be also a very important part of history, which sometimes I don't think gets enough coverage. But sex and romantic passion and so forth has been known to change the destinies of nations and great civilizations. I mean, look at Antony and Cleopatra, for example. One huge example that I think most people know about. There are a million lesser examples. So I was determined to include that element in my books. And the absence of religion, it's very odd in some ways because Tolkien was a deeply religious man who was a devout Catholic, a practicing Catholic, and yet he completely leaves religion out of Lord of the Rings. While I am, although born and raised a Catholic, am not a religious man. I stopped practicing as a Catholic my freshman year of college and realized I never really believed any of this stuff anyway, not for many, many years. I think I gave up belief around the same time I stopped believing in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. They're not really real, you know. And yet, from reading history, I know the importance of religion and religious belief in all of human history, so it would have seemed very odd to leave that out. So I enjoy reading about religions and exploring their belief systems, and I think that spirituality and religious belief is another important part in what shapes human history. So I definitely want to include that too.
Are any of the religions in Westeros based on real religions, the old gods, the seven, the drowned gods, or any of them inspired specifically by real-world religions?
Well, they were all partly original, I think, but they were all also, none of them are made up of whole cloth. Yeah, there were definitely influences. The old gods of the North are, is basically animism or paganism in sort of its most primitive form, where every tree and every rock has a spirit or something like that. The faith of the seven, the more organized religion of the lower part of Westeros, is Catholicism with some twists. Catholicism has at the heart of it the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Never quite, even as a Catholic, figured out the Holy Ghost job there. And basically, he was like delivering messages and impregnating virgins seemed to be his task in this Trinity. But you had the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and there were three. But the nuns were very strict and not three gods. We don't have three gods. We Catholics only have one God, but he has three personas. So I adopted that and made the seven. One God, but seven personas, seven different faces, seven different aspects. And I didn't want to do the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, so I did the Father, the Mother. I wanted to, Catholicism, of course, as the Da Vinci Code has pointed out, has no female aspect here, but it seemed to me to include a female aspect, since women are half the human race, would be cool. So I had the maiden mother crone, half of it, and then the other half is the father, the warrior, and the smith representing all laboring things